Breaking news, we do have this Fox News alert. We're learning China has flown a pair of long-range nuclear-capable bombers around Taiwan for the very first time. And it happened less than a week before President-elect Trump took that congratulatory phone call, as has been described, from Taiwan's leader. Lucas Tomlinson is live at the Pentagon. He's part of the team breaking this story. Lucas, what do we know about this so far?
Well, Jenna, we know that the flight took place less than a week before President-elect Donald Trump spoke to the Taiwanese president. A pair of Chinese nuclear-capable H-6 bombers flew from a base in mainland China, escorted by two other planes. They were doing surveillance, conducted a flight around the island of Taiwan, as you said, for the first time, and we drew a response from the Japanese Air Force, who scrambled 8 F-15 fighter jets to take a look at this unprecedented Chinese flight. And some would say aggression, although one U.S. expert that we spoke to was not surprised at all.
China has steadily built up a massive military capability in the area around Taiwan. This isn't simply a matter of flying bombers. Understand that technically we can't object to flying bombers near Taiwan if we are flying combat aircraft and reconnaissance aircraft near China.
And, Jenna, this isn't, of course, the only threat facing the new president-elect and his administration. Russia continues to challenge the current administration. Just in the last few weeks, Russia has deployed anti-ship, anti-surface, and short-range ballistic missiles to Kaliningrad, a Russian enclave in Europe which borders Poland and Lithuania, and they're in range of many Western European capitals. Last week, I went out to the USS George H.W. Bush, a 100,000-ton warship conducting flight operations in the Atlantic Ocean, getting prepared for its next deployment. I asked the commanding officer of the ship about the challenges he faces.
It is absolutely vital that we understand that Russia's capability has been reinvigorated, and they have certain interests that are divergent from ours. So we need to understand their capability as well as understand strategically what they intend to do, so that if required, we can counter that.
Jenna, that aircraft carrier launched the first airstrikes against ISIS in August of 2014. 2.5 years later, that aircraft carrier is returning to the fight. Now, in a tit-for-tat last week, the U.S. State Department approved a weapons package to Poland to the tune of $200 million of air-to-surface missiles going to Poland, which shows the challenges that still exist. And one other bit of news, Jenna, on Saturday, another Russian fighter jet crashed attempting to land aboard its aircraft carrier in the eastern Mediterranean, the Admiral Kuznetsov. So we'll be watching all the latest and reporting.
A lot of hot spots around the world, that's for sure. Lucas, thank you.
Welcome to the program. We begin this hour with breaking news from Aleppo, where extremists have shelled a Russian military hospital, killing a female paramedic and injuring 2 service personnel. We can now speak to our correspondent in the city, Lizzie Phelan. Well, hello there, Lizzie. So what do we know so far about what happened?
There's been heavy shelling in various areas in West Aleppo. Today, as you said, one of those attacks was a hospital set up by the Russian military due to receive patients, civilians who have fled from East Aleppo. I just come back from the site that was attacked about an hour ago. 9 mortars landed in the area. 1 doctor, 2 nurses, both Russian, were killed. I think now we can listen to a statement from a representative from the Russian Ministry of Defense.
The hospital was ready to start operating this morning. All personnel were present on site, but at 11 a.m. local time, militants started shelling. 1 shell landed at the reception ward. 1 paramedic was killed, another one was injured, as well as the chief doctor of the hospital. The hospital was far away from the front line. Now it is almost totally destroyed.
Rebels opposed to the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad are threatening to form a closer alliance with al-Qaeda and other extremist groups. The moderates are concerned about being abandoned by the Trump administration, according to the Washington Post. For more on this, let's turn to Michael Maloof, a former Pentagon official. Michael, good to have you with us tonight. Allegiances, control, support, and reaction. This is all part of the dynamic that continues to unfold in Syria. identifying the moderates has been the biggest problem the United States has had so far. How is a new administration going to come in and sort out who they're supporting, who they're not supporting when they're hard to identify? Or maybe the Trump administration would be able to identify people a lot better than the Obama administration on this. Your thoughts on it tonight?
Well, my thoughts on it are that the Trump administration has already, and Mr. Trump himself has already said you can't distinguish them. We don't know who they are, who these so-called moderates are. And they have basically shown that. The Ahrar al-Sham, for example, has actually conducted, which is considered a moderate, and the U.S. has been backing, along with Saudi Arabia and Qatar. They have actually carried out operational attacks along with Nusra. So you cannot distinguish them, and it's. And I think the Trump administration is going to say we can't distinguish them either. And this has been the problem now with the U.S. and Russian so-called agreement that they're supposed to be working out. They're not going to be able to do it. The United States isn't going to be able to intervene. And I might add that the so-called moderate groups have already announced. Their leadership has already announced they're not going to stop. They're going to continue fighting, and they're going to join Nusra.
China builds its US policy brick by brick, with not a millimetre left to chance. It's the same way it built this Great Wall, a huge, long-term strategic effort. But on the other side, the style is changing. On Twitter, a social media platform that's not even allowed past the cyber censors here, the so-called Great Firewall of China, Beijing woke to this from the US president-elect, accusing China of unfair currency and trade practices. And this one complaining of Chinese military expansion in the South China Sea. And what should China make of this? Can it read into two tweets from Mr. Trump that he intends to brand China a currency manipulator, to impose tariffs on Chinese goods, and to beef up US naval operations in the South China Sea? And what about his weekend tweets on Taiwan? Wondering why military and trading partners aren't allowed to talk. That was Mr. Trump's response to the storm over his phone call with the president of Taiwan. The president of where? Words matter. China regards Taiwan as a breakaway province and never calls its leader a president, referring instead to the Taiwanese regional leader. But here was Mr. Trump on Twitter again, clarifying that it wasn't him who made the call. For 40 years, China has isolated Taiwan behind a great wall of diplomatic rules, one of which is that a US leader never talks directly to their Taiwanese counterpart. So far, Beijing has blamed Taiwan for that phone call, but it can't blame Taiwan for Mr. Trump's tweets. And it must now wonder what next from @RealDonaldTrump.
Amid tense relations between China and South Korea and American ally, tensions between Washington and Beijing are heating up as well. RT's Afshin Rattansi discussed this with an award-winning journalist and filmmaker, John Pilger, while talking about his new film, The Coming War on China.
There are 400 US bases encircling China. They start in Australia, they go through the Pacific, they go up through Japan, Korea, across Eurasia. It's like a giant noose around China. Missiles, warships, low-draft warships, which can approach China just outside Chinese waters. The provocation of China that has gone on in the last 5-6 years has been extreme. It is extraordinary. It's not only a blockade, it's a blackout. The news, the perception that we're given, we're not allowed to know these important and very disturbing events. But another blackout has been on the biggest military exercise in living memory, and that was Operation Talisman Sabre, which the US last year, 2015, the US led, and in which they rehearsed the blockade of the Straits of Malacca, through which come 80% of China's oil, its resources, its much of its trade, and so on. So this constant provocation is really what that rather innocuous term, pivot to Asia, that Obama announced in 2011 really means.
South Korea's foreign minister has warned that North Korea could illegally transfer nuclear know-how and material to terrorist groups. Making his opening remarks at the International Atomic Energy Agency's conference on nuclear security in Vienna on Monday, Yoon Byung-se said terrorist organizations would be willing to pay huge sums of money to acquire nuclear material, and North Korea could supply it as the regime is currently pressed for cash. Emphasizing the urgent need to counter the North's military ambitions, Minister Yoon said Pyongyang's denuclearization is required for the security of Northeast Asia. The South Korean minister also praised the IAEA's adoption in September of its strongest ever resolution against North Korea for its nuclear provocations.
In one of President Donald Trump's first actions in office, the private files outlining hidden agreements in the Iran nuclear deal may be released. Sources say senior officials who will be part of the Trump administration are already discussing what's so far unseen information about the Iran agreement they will be able to make public after January. The release of these documents echo President Obama's early decision to release the legal justification approving the CIA's interrogation program during President George W. Bush's tenure, in the sense that the incoming administration wants to release potentially embarrassing documents in hopes of turning the page on the last administration's actions. There are many unclassified documents in the case of the Iran nuclear deal that have been held by the Obama administration in tightly controlled security environments that effectively make it impossible for the public to see them.
Moving to Iran, and the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei has warned the United States that Tehran will definitely react if Washington renews sanctions on the country for a further 10 years. Khamenei said the nuclear deal must not be used to put pressure on his country. In another speech published on his website, Khamenei said the U.S. government breached the nuclear deal on many occasions, but did not elaborate. Earlier this month, the U.S. House of Representatives voted on legislation to extend sanctions on Iran. However, it needs the approval of the Senate and President Barack Obama to take effect.
One of U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's pledges on the campaign trail was to levy a punitive tariff of 45% on imports from China, which, in Donald Trump's own words, is killing America on trade. Chinese officials have reportedly threatened to retaliate if he follows through with that. Kim Il-sung reports.
U.S. Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker told the Wall Street Journal on Tuesday that Chinese officials have warned they will retaliate against Washington if President-elect Donald Trump follows through on his campaign promise to impose tariffs on Beijing. Pritzker made the comments in an interview with the Journal on the sidelines of high-level U.S.-China trade talks in Washington. According to her, the Chinese said they would have to retaliate, which, in her words, would harm U.S. workers and industries and the U.S. economy. Trump has said one of his top priorities when he takes office will be to label China a currency manipulator and has threatened to impose a 45% tariff on all Chinese imports. Earlier in the day, Chinese Vice Premier Wang Yang told a gathering of U.S. government and business officials that it's difficult to predict Trump's China policies, but that Beijing is optimistic U.S. business interests will help preserve a strong economic relationship between the two countries. Another uncertainty about Trump is whether his business interests could conflict with his new position in the White House. In an interview with the New York Times, the president-elect shrugged off those concerns, saying that the law is totally on his side and that the president can't have a conflict of interest. Federal conflict of interest laws do exempt the president, and he'll also have the power to change White House ethic rules. But the U.S. Constitution bans government officials from accepting payments from foreign governments, and of course, there are also anti-corruption laws against bribery and fraud. Historically, U.S. government officials have put their assets in so-called blind trusts, about which they have no knowledge and over which they have no control. But Trump runs more than 100 businesses around the world, raising concerns about possible conflicts of interest, even if he hands them over to his children. Kim Il-sung, Arirang News.
What could be better than self-checkout lines at the supermarket? No checkout lines. Amazon's new brick-and-mortar store is making that a reality. It's testing a new smart grocery store in Seattle called Amazon Go. It allows shoppers to literally walk in, grab food off the shelves, and walk out without standing in a cash register line. Customers tap their smartphones as they walk into the store, which then connects them to their Amazon Prime accounts. By using machine learning, sensors, and artificial intelligence, the company says it can track the items customers pick up. Amazon's calling it Just Walk Out technology and is set to open to the public in early 2017.
Well, Google wants to get rid of passwords. Instead of using typical methods for accessing your email or accounts, typical meaning typing in a password, Google Glass now wants to move into the future by using biometrics, including fingerprints and eye scans. Google has filed a patent for head-mounted displays that could scan a wearer's fingerprints, eyeballs, veins, and voice pattern, then use the data to access a website on a computer or a mobile device. And all of this could be in place by 2015. To discuss this, I was joined earlier by Derek Khanna, a fellow at Yale Law School. I started by asking him if biometrics would really make accounts safer.
Potentially. Most individuals have passwords that are relatively guessable. It doesn't take a computer long to potentially predict your password. When you're dealing with details about your fingerprint or your retina or other such private details, it's almost impossible for a computer to guess it.
So there is a legal issue here, though, because just like it makes it impossible for the computer to guess it, legally, if I'm stopped, and we just had a conversation about police officers, if I'm stopped and police want to search my phone, right now, legally, if my phone is protected by a password that I have to speak to an officer, under my Fifth Amendment right, I don't have to share that information. However, courts have already ruled that my fingerprint is not protected because it's evidence, and my eye scan is not protected because it's evidence. Is there an issue here for people who think they're receiving, on some levels, a greater form of privacy, but are actually giving up a certain amount of privacy?
I mean, that's a great point. And in addition to that, you're going to be trusting a company like Google or potentially their competitors like Microsoft with a copy of your retina scan or of your fingerprint. And it's unclear exactly what they're going to potentially do with that information.
Happening now, Cameron County health officials confirming the first Zika virus transmitted here locally. The results just back last week after a lab test. CBS 4's Nora Salinas live in San Benito with more for us. Nora.
Health officials say this isn't just the first case of a locally transmitted Zika in Cameron County, but also in the state of Texas as a whole. The virus was diagnosed on a 43-year-old woman from Brownsville who had not traveled to Mexico or other areas where Zika is prevalent. The woman was not pregnant, but the virus was found in her urine after reporting fever and joint pain. We are told the area she may have contracted the disease is between 14th Street and International Boulevard and between Taft and Garfield Streets in Brownsville, which is where representatives of the health department will be visiting door by door today.
The next steps are really to start looking into the area where the patient may have acquired the Zika virus by mosquito, and do education. Vector control has already been ongoing in that area.
Health officials also tell us they have sprayed areas where the woman could have contracted the virus, but again, they will be going door by door, taking voluntary urine samples of residents living nearby to see if there are any other new cases, and they are urging the public to be cooperative with them so they can get the results correctly. And right now, the 43-year-old woman is said to be okay and no longer contagious, and this is the 9th case of Zika in Cameron County, but the first case that is non-travel related. We'll keep you updated with any new details. Live in San Benito, Nora Salinas, CBS 4 News and Valley Central.